Okay, good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar, The 7 Deadly Sins of Accounting. This is a presentation that we've given a number of times on the event circuits that we normally attend. So I've presented this at Accountex and Accountex North, among others. And as we haven't had an opportunity to come out and meet you in person this year, we've been running these webinars, and we decided this would be a good one to let you see. So we're going to talk briefly about this idea of there being a better way. The 7 Deadly Sins as a talk came out of an article that one of our lead consultants wrote for a publication, thinking about better ways of working. And it was identifying those 7 things we all wish we think we could change. So we'll talk about a better way briefly. Then I'll take you through what we see as these 7 deadly sins. And then finally, we'll close with an example of a customer that we've worked with who experienced, I think, all of them in one form or another. And we'll explain how we delivered a solution to resolve those. But first of all, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Nicky Wilkins, and I head up the customer engagement team for Bluecube. And it's fair to say I have been searching for this elusive better way for quite a lot of my life. I started out life as a financial advisor working in my dad's family business, and I was given the unenviable task of implementing a CRM system. Sadly, this was more than 25 years ago. I don't want to count much further back than that, but I know it was at least that. And it was in the days before dial-up internet, which shows you my age. So in order to synchronize the systems, we had to use a hard disk drive system. What I tended to find when I was trying to put that system in place was that my data was always synchronized nice and neatly, and yet whenever I tried to reconcile against my dad's laptop, it never synchronized. And I often found myself banging my head against a brick wall and saying there has to be a better way. Not a lot changed as I went through my life until I came to Bluecube, where it is literally written above the door as you walk into our offices. And it is very much a maxim of what we do. So we produce very nice, very easy to use, intuitive accounting software for medium to large businesses. One of the things that we do in addition to delivering that software is we solve our customers' problems. We look for operational issues within the business, and we use our software and our service to improve those issues. As I say, that led to us talking to finance heads, getting their feedback, and starting to identify 7 clear sins that occur a lot in business. And through that, we noticed that the role of the finance head has changed really quite dramatically. It used to be that your typical finance director was in charge of producing the management reports and the statutory reports and keeping the ledgers balanced. And these days, while those responsibilities haven't gone away, your modern finance head is far more forward focused. They're looking at return on investment, they're managing the KPIs, they have to be a person in the know of all aspects of what the business does, because they are driving performance forward. And it's no surprise that these days, quite often, managing directors, chief executives will have previously held finance role positions. And what we try to do with our existing customers is help these forward-thinking, these dynamic finance heads do more with the software and with the information available to them. So that led to, as I say, us identifying these 7 deadly sins of accounting, things that we can target and we can change and we can improve within an organization. As I talk through these, I'll be giving you 3 different levels of takeaway, things that if you spot and recognize in your own organization, that you can do immediately to make a change. Things that might require a bit more planning or might require a little bit more time, and then perhaps some larger tasks that certainly will require time and investment in order to achieve. With all of these, we will make the presentation as well as a recording of the webinar available to you afterwards. And also, I will give you my details at the end of the webinar. I won't be taking questions as we go through, but I will be really happy to talk to any of you afterwards. If this resonates with you, if you find yourself nodding and saying, yep, that's me, then I'd be delighted to talk to you and help you think about making ways to change. So let's look at the first one, and it's ownership. It's this idea of being a bottleneck. And usually this is born out of the very best of intentions. What we tend to find with finance heads within an organization is that they are dynamic, they are highly responsible, and they end up taking on a lot more than other people around them. Unfortunately, this can lead to bottlenecks where they are at the center of processes slowing down. You might find that you hear the phrase, I don't have time. You might find that you're saying that yourself. One of the things that lockdown has showed us and COVID has shown us this year is this idea of the metaphorical bus, that thing coming along that knocks you for six, and then not necessarily being a contingency plan for what next. So if that sounds familiar, one of the simple changes you can make straight away is trying to get out of the habit of saying yes. Sometimes we always say yes because we're nice people and we don't like saying no, but we end up taking on more than we should. So that's one thing to think of. But another is then sit down and make a list of your weekly tasks. Then, without taking any time to consider how you might achieve this, just put a ring around them and imagine that they have been delegated to other people. That gives you an opportunity to then consider what you could do with all of that time that you have now delegated away. It might refocus your priorities. It might show you actually what's important about your weekly task and which ones you should be focusing on. Finally, something we will talk more on as we go through these 7 sins because it comes up a lot, but think about automation. If there are a lot of processes that you do that could be completed by using software, then it's certainly something worth considering in more detail. That could be distribution of reports, that could be approving and posting of invoices, making payments, even issuing debt chasing letters. Second one is the duplication of work. So what should you be looking out for if you think this applies to you? Well, multiple touches. I say that carefully. In this context, I mean touches of data. So do you have a situation where information is being keyed into systems in your organization more than once? I would imagine you might. We see it more commonly than anything else. Something that COVID really highlighted was the amount of paper within organizations. Once people were no longer able to work within the office, we all got forced home, you suddenly started to notice actually how many times you click print, how many times you put a piece of paper on somebody's desk, whether that's to share a report, whether that's to get somebody to sign something as an approval. If you've got a lot of paper still in your organization, then it's probably showing you've got a lot of duplication of work. Something that really I saw too much in my corporate banking days was many versions of the truth. I would regularly attend board meetings and management team meetings where everybody would turn up with their own manual Excel spreadsheet returns and be arguing over which version of the truth was accurate. Not only did that waste a lot of energy in the meeting and lead to quite a lot of arguments, but it also highlighted that there was no clear picture of what was real. So how do you change some of these things? Well, another list to be made is the number of reports that get circulated within your organization. If you can sit down and list all of those, I would be willing to bet you will find that many of those reports duplicate the same information. If that's the case, we'll bin them off straight away. Secondly, look at where you are storing information. If you've got a lot of manual data being collected in Excel spreadsheets or in other applications, rather than being directly keyed into a database, then not only are you wasting a lot of time, but you're probably compromising the integrity of that information. And lastly, think about systems integration. So as we say, if you've got a situation where, for example, an order is keyed into your CRM system or your management system, when a customer purchases something, does that then get rekeyed into the finance system at the point where you're going to send the invoice out? If that or any other variance of that is happening, then it's worth considering joining those two systems together. It's my favorite image in this presentation, only looking backwards. So this is something, as I say, that before the role of the finance head changed, is really most commonly what most finance heads, finance directors did within an organization. They only looked historically. They looked at reconciling reports, reconciling transactions, and keeping the historic picture of that organization accurate. They rarely got the opportunity to actually look forward and think about what's changing. If you think that might be you, you've probably already got a good idea already. But if you're not sure, then things to look out for that might be drawing you into that historic view are, do you find you've got a lot of inaccurate transactions within your processes? So do you find that there is a lot of correcting journals or reversing journals or transactions being recoded after they've been posted? Do you find that your processes are quite complex? Do people say, well, it's easier to do that outside of the finance system? It's easier just to print that off and get somebody to initial it on a piece of paper. Do you find you get drawn into rabbit holes, drawn into conversations you'd rather not be in, or debates about what's accurate? If that's the case, then it's quite possible that you may be spending more time looking historically rather than thinking about where the business is going. How do you change that? Well, another list to make. We've talked about listing those reports and binning off the ones that are duplicated. With that list now, the next one is thinking about who creates those reports in the first place. So if you are managing a lot of that data, then there's opportunities for somebody else to learn how to do that themselves. And you can think of that as a gift to give somebody else in a way to train and develop them. If you don't have any methods or warnings in place on looking forwards, then setting up some red flags, some triggers is a good way to begin. One of the things that we've helped people do within the finance system is track the number of contacts and inputs they have with customers, because that very often has a direct relation to bad debt and aged debt. So if you can put red flags in place that tell you when was the last time you spoke to a customer, when was the last time you sent information out to a customer, that will almost certainly drive down the aged debt and flag when there might be an issue. One thing to do to help people make changes within an organization, and it's a methodology that we use ourselves, is this FAST acronym. So we're often brought in and told we want to change our finance system, and the first thing we do is start to ask for facts. So what are the facts that's driving that? Rather than leaping in at the solution and saying, yes, that's great, there's a new piece of technology here, we begin by looking at facts and analyzing what the problem is. Then we can talk about solutions, and then we can test whether that solution is the right one for you. Poor time management. Now, I say this with great care because it's not an accusation necessarily at you, at my audience. It's more about situations where you find you are surrounded by poor time management. So what do I mean by that? Well, a classic example of an organization I dealt with a long time ago was they ended up being fined for paying their tax return late. Now, that's something you would think was easily avoidable, but it came about because somebody had actually been diverted on working on a different task and just had missed that was a key priority. a real ouch moment, but something that could have been easily avoided. So if you have some of those ouch moments in your own organization, perhaps not missing the tax bill, but maybe other payments, other suppliers that you're getting fined for missing payments. If you've got people in your organization saying, I don't have time, it's probably worth asking, well, why not? What is it that's meaning that they can complete their tasks in a timely fashion? And if neither of those apply to you, well done. But something you might want to ask yourself is simply, what's the longest job, what's the longest process that you do in a typical week? Is there a task that you always put off, that you always say, oh, I'll get around to that another time? If that exists, then there's probably something you can do to improve how you're managing it. So simple fixes, well, communicate priorities. Think of that tax return being missed. If people in your organization aren't clear on what gets done first, then it's important to make sure you fix that. The other thing is about thinking about moving the problem. So again, if you've got that phrase being mentioned, I don't have time, maybe it's worth moving the task elsewhere. That doesn't necessarily these days have to be bringing in another headcount into your team. It's perhaps much easier to actually think about outsourced services where people are doing your debt chasing for you, making payments for you, making admin for you. And if that doesn't feel viable, then we say systems and technology now can automate processes far more than they ever have done. We're in a position now with BlueCube where we've got customers that are actually setting up automatic payments. That might feel uncomfortable for you, that idea of an invoice being sent into finance, being put on the system and being automatically paid without somebody cross-checking it. But ultimately, if it's already married to an order where you have an approval in place, why not make sure that payment is simply made on time without delay? Insecurity. Now, I'm talking about data here. I'm not going to get down into your emotional insecurities. What I mean is that in recent years, the finance head within an organization has taken on a lot more responsibility when it comes to data protection. And that may be a task you don't necessarily want. So what do we mean? What should we look for? Well, we've talked about copies of data being held out of the finance system, those elusive Excel spreadsheets. I saw an organization where, in order to make their payment runs, they were downloading all of the payment information into an Excel spreadsheet. That was then being sent by email to another member of the team to cross-check against another manual Excel extract of their CRM system. All those steps sound perfectly normal until we laid that out on a piece of paper and said to the directors in charge, do you realize that all of this secure, financially protected information that you've got in your finance system is now being shared unsecurely by email and being stored locally on people's PCs? And that was a real moment for that organization. I'm happy to say we helped them resolve it, but that might be something similar or might feel familiar to you. That might be a responsibility that you don't want. So simple fixes you can think of. Well, can you share that information securely in a system? Can you put parameters around a finance system that enable users to view, but not necessarily save, extract, or edit? If you don't have that in this modern system, modern day, you may find you need to. If you can actually extend that further so that more of the process is done in the system, whether that's budget control, if we talked about purchasing, so the raising and approval of purchases within a finance system rather than outside of it, that might drive more controls over audit and authority and actually relieve the responsibility from your team. Ultimately, when it comes down to things like GDPR, it may be that you would rather outsource that. That could be moving your system into the cloud. That could be retaining the system and the technology within your own infrastructure, but actually asking a provider to take on the security and the data protection. And that's services that we provide, if that sounds interesting to you. Long-winded and manual processes. We've kind of alluded to these before, but I'll talk through a couple of examples. So yes, the outside of the box situation, so these Excel spreadsheets, or one of my favorites that I saw was simply a payment run, where in order to submit the payment run, we were having a situation where all of the invoices were being printed. A finance clerk was sitting down and reconciling those against another Excel report that said, are these falling due? Those were then all landing on the finance director's desk for the finance director to manually go through sheet by sheet, initial on each invoice, and then that was given back to the finance clerk to then create a manual payment in the banking system. That was a lot of steps, that was a lot of paper, and instead, what we did was show them a situation where the finance system generated that payment run, prepared it, ready to go to the bank, and simply as it went through the system, the finance director simply clicked, yes, I'm happy to make those payments. So if that sounds familiar, how can you make some of those changes? Well, list your checks, list those times when you are reconciling, checking information. Is the software more reliable than a human? It's not always straightforward. It's not always software. Sometimes it is valuable to have that human input, but is there a better way of allowing people to review information than printing out lots of sheets of paper? Assess the risk. So what I mean by this is we see a lot of people reconciling and looking at that information, and they're mainly protecting sometimes only penny errors. Now, yes, finance systems must be accurate, but it is always worth considering the risk versus the time involved in picking up on some of those penny errors. Getting the right people involved is always really key. So when you've got these long-winded processes, it may be that you've got far too many people touching those pieces of paper, printing them out, passing them around. Is it possible to reduce that human element? Not only does that increase risk, but it also dramatically increases costs. The less people involved, usually the far more financially streamlined that process can be. And that leads nicely into this rather subjective question of missing profit. Ultimately, this is probably our main goal when we help organisations, and it's usually something that's nagging at a finance head's mind. It's that idea of there's something we're missing, and that could represent increased revenue, that could represent increased profit. If that is something you're worried about, well, what might you look for to lead you to making changes? It's a little bit more subjective, but some phrases that are worth watching out for. When you're looking around the business and talking to people, if you hear that fantastic phrase, it's impossible, and it's not backed up with a good reason, it is always worth asking why. Usually it's not impossible, it's sometimes just difficult or awkward. Similarly, that phrase everybody knows, or it's a universal truth. Again, if it's not backed up by actual hard evidence, then it is worth gently asking why not. The other phrase that we see when we're in meetings, talking to customers, is the scenario of, well, that's not what we planned. Now, I grant this year, I don't think anybody can say things have gone to plan. But what I'm really meaning is in the course of a typical year, where you're setting up a budget plan, you're setting up a forecast, and actually as you track through that year, the results are wildly different. If you can't find out why that happened, then how can you change it? How might you go about finding out why? Well, the first fix is to make sure that your source information is reliable. We've talked about manual Excel spreadsheets, manual returns outside of systems. This is one of the biggest causes and impacts of allowing that data not to be held in a single source. It creates unreliable information at the point you want to ask questions. If you have got reliable information, then yes, you are in a position to start saying, why did that happen? What could be different? And if you're able to ask the right questions, then start putting measures in place. This is where finance systems come into their own. If you can measure a change, then you can make sure it gets done. If you want to understand more about that, as I say, please do give me a call, drop me an email. I'll happily share with you some examples of ways that we've changed things. Happily talk to you about your own considerations. Okay, it's confession time. So when I present this in person with people, I generally tend to ask people to put up their hand. I shan't do that on this webinar. But if you are finding that as I was talking, you were nodding along to yourself and thinking, yep, that's me, then you might be worth thinking about some changes. I remember doing this a couple of years ago and somebody did put the hand up and said, yes, I'm guilty of all 7. There's nothing wrong with being guilty of these things, but it's always worth from here thinking about changes you might want to make. So a quick run through of those. Ownership, or do you find that you might be the bottleneck when processes slow down? Duplication, do you find within your team you're rekeying or repeating processes that have already been done elsewhere? Only looking backwards, do you find that you're not spending any time thinking about what's coming in the future? You're only looking at and correcting historical transactions. Time management, do you find that time just disappears? And if it does, is there ways of claiming some of that back? Insecurity, are you comfortable that your financial data is being held securely, or might there be gaps in that that need fixing? Manual processes, do you have too many situations where things have been taking place outside of a system rather than using the system to do the heavy lifting? And then loss of profit, have you got that nagging feeling that there is a better way? If you do, then it might be worth starting to think about making a change. So we've given you those 3 levels of takeaway. As I say, we will be providing a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the presentation, so you've got all of those noted down. We'll also give you my contact details at the end, and I'm very happy to explore any of these with you. I promised you a story to finish, and I'm going to introduce you to Bob. Bob, as you can see, is looking slightly disheveled and slightly stressed. Bob's a real person, so he was the finance director of a hearing aid company that we met 3 years ago. And at the time, Bob was facing a really rather difficult challenge where their organisation had multiple income streams. They had a number of shops on high streets throughout the country. They also had hearing aid technicians that were field-based, that would go out and see people in their own homes and provide services and sell hearing aids and batteries and other things. All of those transactions, all of those orders were all being captured manually at point of sale, and then they were being keyed into emails and being passed down into this group of people in the finance team in the bottom right hand corner there. The finance team were fairly disaffected. They spent quite a lot of their time just keying information in over and over, and in some cases they were having to key the same information 2 or 3 times because systems didn't talk to each other. For Bob, the biggest stress that he was facing was that he had to deliver management reports to their group holding company on working day 5. Producing and putting all that information together typically took him between 10 and 15 working days. So he almost always worked at least 1 weekend solidly. Sadly, those reports almost always ended up being late. And sometimes they had inaccuracies in them. So he was not in the best frame of mind. He talked to us, we mapped everything out, and we implemented BlueCube. And as you can see, Bob is looking a lot happier already. What we did was we devolved BlueCube out to those retail shops and those field-based technicians so that they were able to access the system at source. They were able to key transactions in, take receipts, and streamline the data so that it was all in the system already. All finance had to do was make sure that that information was reconciling to the bank and reconciling to their ordering system. from Bob's perspective, he was clicking a report at the end of the month, and it was producing their management reports 4 days early. Because everything was integrated, Bob knew that it was going to be accurate because there was no way for those inaccuracies to creep in. You'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner, there's only 3 people in the finance team now. What that enabled them to do was not cut that headcount, but actually repurpose people and give them a much more interesting role within the organisation. They divided up their practices into 3 regions, appointed 3 regional managers to actually manage the shops, manage the technicians, and start driving business forward, looking for ways to improve, looking for ways to streamline. It's a real organisation that we've helped. If you'd like to know more about that, be happy to talk to you more and actually introduce you to Bob. That's all for now. My name's Nicky Wilkins. I hope you found this talk useful. These are my details, so nicky.wilkins@bluecube.co.uk. If you'd like to talk to me more about anything we've covered today, if you have found, as I say, you've been nodding along and thinking, yeah, that's me, then please do drop me an email. I'd be happy to share experiences with you and help you make a change if that's what you want to do. Thank you. I wish you a good day, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.